Hello and welcome back once again to my back garden, which as you can see I have not done any work in since we started doing these videos, and I've realised over the weeks you can probably spot the greenery growing back through the fence. However, we are here for the 16th instalment of our Bartitsu and Antagonistics Forum online session, which is kind of a little bit exciting and a little bit sad that this will be our penultimate one. So we will have this week's session, and then next week we'll have a final session, and then after that we're all done. And it's been really nice. I've had lots of people asking me why it's all kind of closing down and if I'm okay. And the answer to that is no, but that's a whole other issue. I've got some mental health issues going on at the minute that I need to look to, but that's not actually the reason I'm stopping. The reason I'm stopping doing these is partly because I'm running out of material that I can teach without having somebody else here. I can't really go into jiu-jitsu, I can't really go into grappling, I can't go into any of the intricacies of swordplay without having somebody else to actually mimic the other side of the attacks. So I'm not going to waste people's time by just creating stuff to teach you. So I'm kind of running out of that material, so I'm going to call it quits there. And my aim at the minute, although it hasn't been confirmed, is I'm going to try and take August as a holiday. We'll all have a month off. And then September, I'm hoping we'll be back to face-to-face training and getting on with things as we were before. So this is really just the last couple of sessions. But I know I'll be gone for a month, but I have left you, by that point, hopefully 17 hours worth of training that you're welcome to review. And if you can get through that in a month, you're doing quite well, okay? So you can revisit it all. It's all going to be there. I'm going to port it all over to Facebook and stuff as well. But for tonight, which is the important bit, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be starting off looking at Cutlass, really looking around the kind of situational, the kind of context, that's the word I'm looking for, the context of Cutlass, so you understand what it is we're actually trying to do. So we'll be looking at Cutlass. I'm then going to skip the ramble for the minute and go straight into the second section where we'll be looking at some of the basic principles of using two weapons. It seems really obvious. If you have two hands and you have two weapons, you have a better chance. The answer is only if you have some idea of knowing what you're doing. So we'll be looking at that. And I'm going to finish off with the ramble, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the different offhand weapons that are there, because obviously I don't have time to go through each one in detail. And that should take us up to round about the 8 o'clock mark and the end of the session. So anyway, thank you for joining me, and we will start off by falling in as we normally do. So attention and fall in. Okay. In terms of safety, a lot of what we're going to be looking at today involves weapons and stuff. So normally I would say long sleeves, which I'm not doing really badly. Partly because it's just too warm for that, but the reason that you normally wear long sleeves is so that if you get a blade hitting you, there's no chance of really getting a metal scalp or a kind of splinter in you, or any cuts and grazes. I'm not going to be sparring tonight. I have nobody here to spar with, so I feel quite safe with exposed arms, but I wouldn't normally if I was training. I am wearing my gloves so that I don't rip my hands up, but as usual, go at your own pace, and if you are interested in doing this stuff, make sure you get decent equipment. It's really easy to pick up a cheap and really terrible sword, and if you try any of these drills, you'll probably be fine, and if you try them with another person, one of you will get hurt. So if you're going to move into this, make sure, ideally go find a group and train with them, and they'll have all the right equipment and they'll sort you out. If you are trying on your own, make sure you get decent equipment. It's really important. Okay, so let's start off with Cutlass. What are we talking about with Cutlass? I don't actually have a metal cutlass. It's one of those things that's on my wish list. I must get one at some point. What I do have, though, is my trusty wooden waster cutlass. So as you can see, it's actually a really short blade. Let's have a look at the anatomy of this. So we have quite a short blade. As you can see there, probably only a couple of feet in terms of length of the actual blade. It's got a back. There's no edge to this, so I can quite happily put my hand on it, as you'll see we'll do. Curved blade. A simple knuckle bow guard, and the handle and pommel. That is our Cutlass. And we're very much going to think about this much more as a large knife than we are a sword. But I'm going to come to that more later on. To start with, we need to understand the context. When was Cutlass used? Okay. Now I know the dream is that it was used in some kind of way, like what's the film I'm thinking of? Pirates of the Caribbean, with these big masters of swordsmanship, giant epic battles, and that just really wasn't how Cutlass was taught. Cutlass was a backup weapon. Okay. At the time where Cutlass is being used, they're used for naval combat. So these are being used on ships. One of the reasons they're being used on ship is when you actually hang it, it hangs down the side of your leg, and it's not sticking out behind you like a side sword or a saber or something would, where it's going to get entangled in ropes. So because it's more knife-sized, you can carry it around without it being in the way. But this means we're using it when we're on a boat, okay? And when you have boat-to-boat combat, okay, having a 2-foot reach on top of your normal fist is not going to help you attack another ship. What you're going to use is cannons. Big cannons. And you're going to have muskets. And you're going to have pistols. And you're going to use all of those gunpowder weaponry to try and blow the other ship out of the water. And that's really what a lot of naval combat's about. However, occasionally they will survive this, or one side will be deliberately trying to take the other ship without destroying it. They will essentially launch grappling hooks, pull the two boats together, and then you get what's called a boarding action, which is suddenly you can't fire the cannons because the ships are that close together. You're blowing your own ship up as much as you're shooting them. So we come to a boarding action, and it comes to hand-to-hand combat of the crews. Now this is when everything has gone wrong. So nobody was taught Cutlass as a great swordsman style, because that time would have been better spent learning how to prep and fire cannons quicker. So you get kind of, if you were joining a navy, you'd get maybe a day of Cutlass training. That's it, on you go. If all else goes horribly wrong, you can fall back on this when you actually come to it. But it wasn't really ever designed to be used. And if people had other weapons, they would quite often take them with them. So a lot of people would use muskets and bayonets were quite commonly used. Pikes, billhooks, clubs, all these kind of things that people had. If you took them with them, you could use that instead of your Cutlass quite happily. It wasn't quite as regimented because hopefully it was never really going to be a thing. So with that in mind, we need to think about the footwork of Cutlass. Okay? Now, I haven't spent a lot of time on footwork, although it is vitally important, because it's normally very, very dull. But Cutlass is different. In Cutlass, if I'm squaring off against somebody, I don't actually care whether they live or die. And that is very different to most other sword fights, where I want, if I'm fighting for honor, I want to get first blood, or I want to kill my opponent. If I'm in a battle situation, I want to incapacitate or kill my opponent. In Cutlass, I either am boarding their ship, in which case I want past them and onto their ship, where I can grab whatever I'm looking for, cut ropes, whatever it is my objective is. But actually, killing him isn't normally my objective. The other option is, I'm standing and the other person is charging at me, in which case I don't actually care whether they live or die, I just don't want them to get past me and onto my ship. So most of this happens with one person essentially running and jumping at the other person, and the other person trying to stop them. Both of them armed with sharp metal things, so it does become a kind of sword fight, but it's much more about positioning and movement than a lot of other weapons, because people don't know how to use the Cutlass particularly, and it's about either getting on or stopping somebody else getting on. Now, of course, all of this is happening on a boat, which will be moving, especially if there's two boats bashing into each other. And somewhere between the combat, the two bits of ship will have met each other and be rising up and down at completely different times. So footwork is also unsecure. So all in all, this is a really, really stupid time and place to have combat. And it doesn't happen one-on-one. It happens 20 against 20 in a mass melee of chaos, okay? And one day I want to get enough people together that we can actually do this and have a proper boarding action. I haven't yet, but from the pictures and stuff I've seen, it seems like chaos. Anyway, let's get on to what we were talking about, which is footwork. Now, as I said, Sorry, I've just got an ice cream van going through. It must be that time of day. Is I want to get... Sorry?
Board the ice cream van.
Board the ice cream van. Yes, possibly. Right. As I said, my aim is I want to get past somebody. So let's have a somebody. I didn't think this through. I don't have a somebody to move around. So we shall move to the traditional jumpers for goalposts. This is now my person. I don't want to essentially run up to them and stop and have a sword fight as everything's moving around. I want to get past them. And the best way to do that is something essentially called a pitch and roll. And that is essentially where I take, where I pass forward. Okay? And by pass forward, I mean if my leg is front, I've got front leg, back leg, my back leg swings round into the opposite, opposite position. So that's a pass forward, that's a pass back, and I'm going to do three of these essentially to move right the way around my opponent. So when I reach my opponent, one of my feet will be forward. In this case, this foot here. I'm going to temporarily do something that seems mind-numbingly stupid and turn my back briefly on them. Well, I will hit here. Where am I going to go? I'm going to go this way. 1, 2, 3. And I'm now facing my opponent's back. So I charge in, my foot lands, 1, 2, 3, and then I can literally turn my whole body about and move in the opposite direction. Now the reason for that is I can keep myself in control of this fight. From here, I have my sword in front of me, I can attack. From here, I still have my sword, I am in close to them, the combat is happening here. Temporarily, I am moving so my back is exposed. There's no quick way around somebody without a moment of exposure. So this is where you want to spend the least amount of time. And then I'm going to turn, and again, I have my back to the facing my opponent's back at that point, hopefully. So from the other side, I move, I land, 1, that, 2, 3. There we go. That's it. Yes. Try it from the side. I wonder if that works. So other foot this time. So other foot landing this time would then be 1, 2, 3. And as I said, I can then turn and move off. So it's important we understand that this is actually happening with two people barreling around each other rather than two people face to face, because that changes the way that you do things around. So with that understanding of how we're actually moving, let's move on and actually look at some combat. Okay? The combat has to be simple because A, you're focusing on your footwork and not falling over, and B, it's going to happen quickly. Okay, you're going to have maybe 2 or 3 seconds of engagement, and all of your fencing has to happen in that time. So, we would normally start, we're armed, we only have one weapon, front foot forward is the one that is holding the sword. Traditionally for Cutlass, your hand goes above your head, other hand can be resting on the back of the blade, or it can be in close to the body. But the important bit is the Cutlass is already above and guarding your head. Okay? Which means if anything is coming straight down on top of you, you already have it parried. The reason for that is it was believed that a man would simply, that is the action he would take. And therefore, if that is the unconscious action, in fact, I think it tends to be more of a 45 degrees cut, but that will still all get caught on this guard without you having to do anything. The only thing you've got to worry about is the slight exposure of the fingers, which you might have to block by twisting the hand forward to make sure it's caught on that knuckle bow. Little flick there. But other than that, you are covered from above. So you only have to worry about attacks coming in from the side as you charge. Okay? So that is our guard position. That's not to say you can't come on guard with the sword to the side, or even on the other side, as you would be familiar from other swordsman styles, but traditionally you start here. And really, there are 5 parries that we need to be aware of, and one of them we're already in. Okay, parry to the top here. If I want to parry on this side, so something coming in to attack me at this side, my hand is going to go up to support. Okay, because I don't know how big the other guy is, what weapon he's using, but normally I would prepare to brace and get a double hand parry in there. If I want to parry this side, I will move that hand over the top into what we would think of from Sabre or something as prime or first. There's my parry. My hand stays on it, so parry from there goes across. If, however, I want to stop something coming in at this side of the arm here, coming in on the other side, I'm going to drop my hand down into what we'd think of as third. Again, I can brace that with my other hand if need be. So rather than in a lot of systems where it kind of moves and the hand stays down, this one is an arc, like a rainbow or something above my head. This is how I am protecting myself from any cuts that come in. My hand just moves around. If I'm in this guard, something coming from my head, I'm there. Something coming here, it goes over the top and catches it on that side, okay? So it moves like this. Now that's great because that gives me really strong two-handed blocks against anything that's coming in as a cut. The problem is if something is coming straight at me as a thrust, this will not catch it because I'm literally moving around that target. So I need two more parries just in case something is coming in on that centre line. One of them is to drop this hand across into what we'd think of as fourth. And again, I've got that double hand block, but that scooping motion through the centre will catch a blade and move it to the side. So from my high position, I'm going to move it across. Likewise, I'm this time going to use the other hand and drop into a very high second position, if we were thinking about other fencing styles, there. So from here, cuts are parried over there, and then thrusts parried across the centre line. Okay? That is our basic defence. Whatever comes in, we can now stop it with that unless it's coming at our legs. In which case we're probably going to jump or move our legs rather than try and parry it with something this size. So, from there, you've got your attacks that you need to be aware of. And we already know these. There are 8 lines of attack, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? They're the cardinal compass points, 8 points, cardinal plus semi-cardinal, whatever you call them. The 8 lines of the compass, if you think about it, those are our cuts. If you want to go back and review Moulinet sequence, we've talked about this several times. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it today. But I've got those cuts that I can go through. So if I'm parrying here, I can cut there. If I'm here, I can cut diagonally down that way. If I'm here, there's nothing to stop me going diagonally up that way. Okay? We know all of these cuts already from other styles, so I'm not going to focus on them now. Okay? The only difference is that we might decide to apply extra pressure with this hand on the back of the blade. So rather than just cutting, let's think of a good angle, if instead of cutting diagonally across here, I may decide to use both hands in that swing to get more of a clobber and a purchase in. If the other guy's big, I reckon he's going to parry strongly, possibly wearing armour. I might want to drive in with a bit more effort. So there's nothing to stop me swinging those through. Harder to do from the other side, and certainly once you start getting lower, that just becomes ridiculous. But you have those options. The other thing you have is 2 thrusting positions. One, which is more likely to be used, is from this kind of hanging guard here. And then the thrust comes in on that high line. However, if you did have your hand lower, there's nothing to stop you lowering that point and coming in from there on a low line thrust, as you would think of in a lot of swords. But normally, because your hand starts high, it's going to be that higher line that you're actually on. Because the only time your hands are going to be down low is either after you've taken a cut on that side. You could then thrust in low. Right, okay, so that covers our basic attacks and defences, and I've already been going for 20 minutes, so this is going to be a long session. Okay, where do I want to go after that? Right. The important thing then to realise is that if I come in against somebody and my footwork falters, okay, if I can slide past them, great. I can take a block, yeah? There's my foot being planted. I block, okay? My first step coming through will be a cut. This is a bad angle for the camera. Let's try that again. Block, yeah? Block that way, sorry. I'm going to step. There's a cut. As I'm passing through, my hand is coming up, and then a swipe through at the back, and then turn and keep moving. So that's how I'm aiming to move around. But what will happen frequently is you will catch somebody, and both of you end up 2 hands on, with the blades touching in what we call kora or body-to-body fencing, where you're both in close and it becomes almost like wrestling. Okay, so I'm here, their blade is going across in the opposite direction, and we're both pushing against each other. Okay, and this is where it becomes useful to be familiar with that backhand push, because from there I can slide over the top and make that a cut, even though I'm actually opposed by somebody else's blade. Okay? Now, this is where the other important bit comes in. I have this knuckle bow here, okay? And I'm going to use that as a knuckle duster as often as I'm going to use the sharp part of the blade. So as well as being able to slide over the top, there is nothing to stop me rising up with an uppercut using that knuckle bow to attack my opponent's face. Okay? And that might be from the top. I can slide that way, I can knuckle duster that way. If I'm over here, yeah, I've got my slide in with my cut, I've got my over the top with the knuckle duster. So wherever I am, if I end up in that situation where I've been parried and I have both hands on it, I can slide as I'm going and try and hit with the top part, or I can push through with the backhand and try and land a punch with the knuckle duster. Okay? All of that means that it gets very, very messy very, very quickly. And again, without somebody here, it's really hard to kind of demonstrate and show you how these kind of things work. But it was important you understand that both sides of these are going to be used. And that's where I'm saying it's more like a knife. Okay? I'm going to try and roll around my opponent's guard with the sword, rather than a traditional parry, I attack back. I'm much more likely to parry, try and move around my opponent and cut, come back. Much more as a big sliding surface than as a, this is the bit I attack with, this is the bit I defend with. They both become attack and defense. Oh, pardon me. Right. Where was I going to go there? Yeah, so the traditional boarding action ran something like this. I need another piece of equipment here. So, you are armed with one pistol, one sword, okay? So you take the pistol in your good arm. This is the traditional boarding method. And as you are approaching, they get close together, the boats get closer together, you take aim and you fire off your pistol as the two boats are coming together. Okay? Now, bearing in mind, these are not particularly accurate pistols. The average sailor wasn't a trained marksman with them. You're on a moving boat, firing really further than the range of the weapon. So let's face it, that's pretty much a wasted shot, at which point the plan was then to discard off the pistol. It was no longer needed. The pistol gets thrown away, you draw your sword, you are now armed with a sword, and you have your offhand free to grab rope, rigging, whatever you need to get onto your opponent's ship, okay, and start that fight. Or indeed, you're ready then to defend against them trying to board your ship. The problem with that is, you've discarded quite an expensive piece of kit after using it to fire a completely pointless shot. So this was changed after a while to create a better system of doing this. And that system was instead, the pistol, I've picked it up at the wrong time, the pistol would be in your belt. And it stays in its holster on your belt, and you have the sword drawn in your right hand. You let the ships come together and you don't fire any shots. There's no point wasting it. From there, you've got your offhand and you can climb onto their ship. You can wait for them to come to you. You can get in nice and close. Once you're in nice and close and you've got firm footing, then you can draw your pistol and in the offhand, fire at close range. Although it's your offhand, because of the close range, the weapon is much more likely to score a hit, okay? So the idea is you can then fire with the offhand at close range, and then you hang on to it, okay? So you've still got it, you haven't discarded it, you've used a much more successful shot. What do you do with it from there? Because now, it's kind of in the way from me using my two hands in this way. Now there are two options. The traditional way is to turn it round once you've fired it and grab the barrel, and this big, nice, heavy lump of metal at the end is a really nice club. So I can go back to my guard, I have my club on the other side, and now really this is the only place that I'm worried about defense, and I can block that really easily. And either, realistically, I'm not going to try and block with this because it's not a great shape for actually stopping something hitting my knuckles or blocking. But what I'm quite likely to do is potentially block with the Cutlass and then try and strike with the flintlock into my opponent's head. Trying to essentially cave their skull in. Or, you know, likewise I can take it up at the top, come through with just a thrust into the stomach. Again, with the weight and force of that, I can do some damage. There is another alternative, which I personally quite like, which is once you've fired it, you turn the pistol around and instead hold it down your arm. Now, bearing in mind, we're dealing with a pistol that has a really solid piece of metal tubing along the top, okay? This is not a modern firearm. This isn't a delicate precision piece of equipment. This is a tube, okay? So I can happily have that down my arm, and if a cut comes in, it will be stopped by the pistol. So that allows me to adopt this position here. Okay, much easier if I want to bring that hand in as a second lever. I've got that cover there, and if I need to, I've still got to swing with the barrel of it, or indeed a thrust, much like a knuckle duster, with the heavy butt. Okay? So I quite like this as a defensive style, so once I've fired, I'll have the pistol down my arm, adopt my stance here, and prepare to fight. Okay? So, a much better way of using it, and I quite like a pistol being used in that fashion. Right, so where does all of that lead us? All of that leads us to thinking about using two weapons. Okay? And that's really what we're going to talk about for the next little bit. So I'm going to ditch the Cutlass for a minute. And I'm going to ditch the flintlock. I'm going to grab a quick drink because, as usual, I'm talking way too much. And we'll move on to talking about fighting with two weapons. In this case, I'm picking two generic weapons. For me, I am a fan of side sword, so I'm going to use a side sword. And in this case, I'm going to use a main gauche, just an offhand parry dagger, because I can use these to explain everything I want to. They're relatively big and visible, and they cover most of the points. Right, so what we need to do is start thinking about two-weapon fighting. And the first thing I'm going to do when we come to thinking about two-weapon fighting is I'm going to put down all of my weapons. And we're going to start this with no weapon fighting. Because when we are in our boxing guard, whichever boxing guard you prefer, you have two fists. Okay? So you innately have this idea of using multiple parts of your body. If you're trained, you're probably now thinking, well, I've got two fists and I've got 2 feet. If you're more trained, well, I've got 2 elbows, I've got 2 knees, I've got a head, you know, and I've got these wiggly arm bits and leg bits that I can use if I want to move into jiu-jitsu. You have a plethora of weapons possessed on your body already. Okay? So what we need to do is explore what we do naturally and extrapolate that in some way into using two weapons. Okay? The only difference is suddenly our reach becomes much extended and we need to adapt for that. But in reality, when we look at boxing, okay, one of the problems that you see in a lot of boxing is that somebody will parry and then somebody will punch. Parry, punch. Parry, punch. And it goes back and forward because every time you punch, the other person parries. Then they punch and you parry, and you punch and they parry, and it goes back and forward forever. That kind of back and forth timing. So what we have to do is start using both fists to gain the advantage. And there's really 2 ways that we can do this. One of them is that we can do a simultaneous defense and attack. So rather than block and attack, I block and attack at the same time. Really basic principle. Block and attack. It could be block and attack. I don't really care how you do it. Whether block, attack. It just has to happen in the same kind of timing. So not block, attack, block and attack. So that's one option. The other option is I can use both hands to effect something more clever. I can use them in coordination. So that might be a punch coming in and getting a double grapple, so that I'm then looking at wrist and elbow into an arm lock or something. It can even be that I'm looking at a block coming in and then going for something like a head clench if I'm going to try and control them. I can use my hands coordinated, or I can change the timing. The same is absolutely true when we start looking at two weapons. I just want people to be aware that you already are used to using multiple weapons. We're just going to extend that principle. Okay, so we're now armed. I have a weapon in each arm. The principle's the same. I just have longer things to deal with. So the first thing we have to look at is there's two possible stances that I can adopt. And we call these offensive and defensive. Now, if I was armed with two equal weapons, it wouldn't matter. Okay? Now, obviously, I would be better with one hand than the other unless you're ambidextrous. So you would normally favour one, but I'm deliberately having one longer than the other to explain this concept. The first is if I have my main weapon forward. I am in the offensive stance. I am creating as much range as possible for attacking my opponent, but I have reduced the range at which my parrying weapon comes into play. The other option, if I have the shorter weapon forward, I am in a defensive stance. I have taken away from my range to attack, but in turn created more range for my offhand weapon to work. So defensive stance, the short weapon's forward. Offensive stance, the longer weapon is forward. And it's important you understand not just what those stances are, but why you will use them at different times. So I will normally come on guard in an offensive stance because I'm hoping to win this fight really quickly. But if they then press and attack, I may come into my first parry as I drop back so that I've got more room to work and I'm more defensive. If they then give ground, I might decide to move back to my offensive stance to follow them up. Okay? So it's not like pick one or the other, but knowing they're both available and how you come on guard. The other thing you have to be aware of is you have two weapons. We should use these to cover as much ground as possible. When we have a guard, the difference between a guard and a parry is what you use to stop an attack. And it's a movement from one guard to another. I move something and I move a blade out of the way. A guard is where I choose to hold my weapons, and the reason for that is it cuts down where I can be attacked. Okay? With Cutlass, sword above my head, you cannot attack me straight down, you have to come sideways. That's a guard. So what I might have is a low guard with my heavier weapon off to one side down here. This is now low and on this side. So where do I want to have my other hand? Okay, this would be stupid because I'm opening up this whole side of my body. Okay, here is not great. My head is really open. So what I'm going to do is, if you imagine a car steering wheel, or a ball or whatever, your hands want to be on opposite sides. So if this one is low and down, this hand is going to come high and on the outside. And the reason for that is I'm covering as much ground as I can in terms of where I can defend. And I'm also cutting down, essentially, in this case, if I over-exaggerate it, I can now really only be attacked down that centre line. Okay, so I know where I'm allowing myself to be attacked, and therefore I'm ready for it and ready to parry. Okay? If this hand was high, you see I've done it automatically, the other hand drops low. If this was to do something stupid like cross my body, the other one will ideally, in this case, because I'm carrying that low, cross the body to be in that opposite position to keep as much guarding space as I've got. Okay? So now you know how to pick a guard and you know how to hold those swords. The next thing you need to do is think about your defense. Okay? And it's really easy. If something is coming in at this side of my body, I am going to defend it with this weapon. If something comes in at this side of my body, I'm going to defend it with this weapon. Okay? Really easy. The problem is, what if something comes down the middle? Okay? And the problem that people tend to get is they go, oh, I'm going to... And your blades get tangled. Yeah? Or I'm going to... And then, oh, hang on a minute. I've caught my own blade across here and I've left myself open. Make a decision what's covering your center line. Okay? It doesn't matter. Normally, because this is my defensive weapon, I would choose to parry my center line with the dagger. So I'll be here. If something comes on this side, I parry it here. If something comes this side, I parry it here. If something comes on that center line, I will parry it with the dagger. But I could equally parry anything that comes on the center line with the sword. Okay? But I know which one I'm doing. And I let it do it. I don't or decide as the attack comes in. I have a default. I may choose not to use it because I have a cunning plan, but it means that if I'm panicked, I don't... If I panic, I'm still going for it with one weapon and keeping the other one free, ready to use. Okay? Hopefully this is all making sense, okay? So now we've looked at the defense, we need to go back to what we were looking at before. Okay? Now what I can do is I can parry and attack. And then I can parry, and then I can attack. And then I can parry and attack, and parry and attack. And it's exactly the same as we were looking at with those punches earlier. What I need to do is change the timing so that I can do a simultaneous attack and defense. And that's really easy to do. So as I parry up here, I'm going to lunge forward with the sword and kill at the same time. Okay? I might parry with the sword, but at the same time I'm going to step through and come through with the cut with the dagger. As long as I'm parrying with one and attacking with the other, it's all fine. Okay? So one thing we can do is we can take the timing. What was I looking at there? Is that all? Yeah. The other thing we can do is we can use them in coordination to have a more interesting effect, shall we say. Okay? I know I'm going through this quite quickly. We can start trying to use them together like we would do if we were grappling. We're using both hands at the same time. Okay? So an example of that would be, let's see what I had written down here so that I can... right. So one option, as I said, is we may choose to use a different parry. A parry with the other weapon than we'd expect. Okay? The reason for that is if somebody attacks me on this side, they will be expecting me to parry with this sword. Okay? What I want to do is if they attack on this side, I might decide to parry with the dagger instead. But I'm aware of this, it is a conscious choice. It's not an inbuilt response, it is a conscious choice as part of my tactics. I might cross parry and lunge over the top. Yeah? I may decide to go above, lunge underneath, but I have that option to go to the wrong side of the body and still deliver my kill at the same time. Okay, so I'm using them in a slightly different way. Another option, and this is one that I use quite a lot, is if an attack's coming in, I might take the parry here, and then rather than going for the body, at the same time as I'm taking the parry, my other blade will move at the same time to cut at the attacking limb. Okay, so if I was thrusting out the sword is parried, and at the same time, the knife will come in to cut the wrist or the forearm. Okay, and it works really well with a lot of weapons, especially if I'm in that offensive stance. If I can take that parry and step forward with it, I can get quite a nice cut to the inside of the arm. Okay, so I'm using both weapons to affect one thing. If you want to start going really fancy with it, you can come to what is one of my favourite moves, and if you've ever seen me do a demo with swords, it will have had this move in it, which is a semicircular parry on the outside to catch a blade. From there I'm going to do something called an envelop, which is literally to move their blade across to the other side of the body. So if you imagine their blade has come in, I have caught that blade, and I have moved it to being pointing up at the other side of the body. So I catch it, I move it to the other side of the body, I pass it off to the dagger. So from here I run my dagger up, catch their blade, and from there I can either go into a cut, or I can come over the top and go into a lunge, and their blade is still stuck on my dagger. So I've caught it with the sword, passed it off to the dagger, delivered my culling blow whilst keeping their weapon under control. Okay, I'm using the two weapons, I'm learning little tricks where I can combine them to take the advantage from my opponent. The other great thing is if the other person is the same handed as you, in which case if they were right-handed facing me, that attack when I take it to the outside, their other blade is further away because their body is now across me. So opening that up, I can take that centre line back when they're clearly expecting me to go around the outside. Again, kind of difficult to envisage without another person here. The ones that I really want you to be aware of, parry and attack at the same time, and the attack and remove the offensive limb. Okay? If you break their hand, if you break their wrist, they cannot continue to fight you with that weapon. Whew, right, covered quite a bit there. There's also defensive combinations that we can use. And probably the most obvious of these is the double parry. Okay, now this is normally used when I think my opponent is stronger or is using a heavier weapon, and I think if I try and parry something like my head, it's going to crash through and I'm going to get hit anyway. So what I do is I do a double parry. Okay, and this looks like straight out something out of Three Musketeers. I'm going to try and catch the blade in between those two bits. So the blade hits in here, and I can hold it really solidly, and I've got a really solid two-hand defense. The important thing when doing that is to know what your weapons are doing. If you have a long and a short weapon, make sure the long weapon is on top. Yeah? The reason for that being, if it's on the bottom and I block here, I can't draw it to the side because my knife is in the way. Dropping it here and trying to thrust through is a really awkward movement. If it's on the top, however, I can swing it away from behind me, keeping control of their weapon, in for a strike, or even if I need to, bringing it in a controlled way for a thrust. So make sure the long one is on top. The reason for that is, the short one, if I want to, I can drop and deliver on that line. I can cut away because it's shorter, but I can't do that if the short one is on top. It entangles the long one. So double parries, long one on top. And that's the same if I go sideways. I've still got to make sure that one is free to come away. If I'm going to the other side, it's still on top so that it's free to come away. Okay, so that's double parries. Really useful if you are against somebody really aggressive. What was the other one I had? The other one is you can, depending on the weapon you've got, you can engage in other little tricks. Okay, so one of them is, for example, I'm using a main gauche here. What I can do is if the blade hits and I parry and it goes down to here, I can twist that blade, it'll be that way here, and catch it between the quillions and the sword. And what happens is it actually binds my weapon. Not greatly, I mean I can still break it out, but for a brief second my opponent's weapon is held fast in one position, and that allows me to stab. Okay, so I'm catching, binding and thrusting. There's nothing to stop as well other options where I might, after I've taken a parry, maybe I did do something wrong and I parried stupidly across the body. I can still use that to come up and catch and bind and then bring my main weapon back into play. So knowing that this can bind, I can do other things with it. Another option would be something like a cloak, where I can smother my opponent's attack. So I might take my parry, so their blade is now along here, and I can literally then drape that extra weight as I come in for my attack. So the other person who has done a thrust, had it parried, and then suddenly has that extra weight that pulls their blade down for a second whilst I'm attacking them. So, knowing a few little tricks with each weapon can allow you to use them a little bit better, but the basic principle remains. Either you're changing the timing to attack and defend in a single time action, or you're using them together in some way to create an advantage. Now we've looked very much at swords here, but let's have a look at some of the other stuff we could be looking at. Let's take this to really the other end of the spectrum, something much more Bartitsu. I now have a walking stick, and okay, this is an eskrima stick, but this could be two halves of a broken pull cue or whatever. Okay, my same principles apply. Here, I'm much more offensive because I have more range. Here, I'm much more defensive because I'm using my defensive weapon forward. I pick which one I'm using, and I make sure the other one is covering the opposite side, so that I'm always covered for wherever the weapon is coming. I know what is parrying where. Okay, this one is parrying that center line, and this one is parrying that side. I'm then looking for parry and attack at the same time. Yeah? Parry, attack, same motion. I'm looking for attack the hand. Double parries. Strike. Yeah? All of these same things we've talked about work equally well if you're holding two sticks as they do if you're holding a sword and dagger. It holds true if you're holding a sword and buckler. All of the other stuff we're going to talk about, because I've got about 10 minutes left or so to talk about them, all of those same principles apply, okay? Now, I haven't gone into any great detail and technique. What I've tried to do is give you the core basic principles. If you learn those and you practice those and you get people to fight you whilst you're practicing, you will very quickly pick up the proficiency to use two weapons. Not amazingly, but when you pick up two weapons, you will not, there will be an advantage to you rather than a disadvantage. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, if you just pick up two weapons and hope for the best, you will tie yourself up and you will make a mess of it. With some practice, you can get really good at the basics, and then it becomes a real advantage to you to have two weapons. Okay, so let's have a look at what weapons we have available to us. So really, for the next kind of 10 minutes, what I want to look at is some of the common offhand weapons that you might encounter. And the first of them, let's switch over. I'm going to use a rapier for a bit. I haven't used a rapier for a bit. So, oh, suddenly feels really light. The first offhand weapon I have to be aware of is the empty hand. It's not having a weapon, okay? There's a reason why in a lot of fighting styles, especially if you've been taught by me rather than other people, the weapon, the offhand will stay in front of you here. I know in a lot of fencing styles it ends up behind. Saber is sometimes back here. I like to keep it in here simply because I might get to a situation where they come in and I end up with a really close parry in here, in which case I'm going to throw that out as a straight punch, okay? I may get a situation where I get a parry and I can step in and seize their hand, yeah? In which case I want to be able to take advantage of that, okay? If I'm dealing against something like a rapier, I can even, as a thrust is coming in, slap it offline without cutting myself. As soon as I slide, I cut myself, but if I can bounce it, I can actually move a weapon offline if it's coming in with a thrust with an empty hand, okay? So knowing that you have an empty hand as your second weapon, it's the worst of the offhands, but it is still there and shouldn't be forgotten about. Okay, we had a look at dagger, so I'm not really going to cover dagger again, because as I said, we have kind of already looked at it. I'm not going to cover pistol, because we kind of covered that when we're looking at Cutlass. Let's look at some new and interesting stuff instead. What are we going to look at? We're going to stick with the pirate theme for the minute. Oh, pirate theme. I should probably be back to a Cutlass. That makes more sense. Let's look at some more piratey weapons, and one of them is a belaying pin. Now, okay, this isn't a belaying pin. This is a very small rolling pin, but it's about the same kind of size. And what they are is they're around a ship. You literally, there are holes in the ship, you stick it in, and you tie a bit of rope to it to tie something off. Okay? You've heard of the command belay that, it just means tie it off so it stays in that position. But if you pull it out, it is a small club and worth being aware of. Okay? So if I'm back to my basic stance, okay, I can parry with it, it's not great at it, but I can certainly do that attack, block and attack. I can even double parry with it if I really needed to, and I've certainly got attacks with it that I have available to me, okay? Really simple. If you have seen the other previous videos, okay, you might be aware of other things you can do as a short and flexible. I could theoretically take a block and look to slam it into an armpit or into the kidneys and start using it like a truncheon to try and move somebody in a direction, especially if all I'm looking to do is get past. So I have those kind of options with a belaying pin. Where are we going after belaying pin? Oh yes, another common one. Again, from ships. The axe is not there as a weapon, okay? And that's why it's not really covered in any treaties that I've found anyway. The axe is there to cut ropes, okay? If you need to let something go really quickly, you pick up the axe and you slice it through the rope and into the wood behind it. It will sever that piece of rope, and whatever is causing problems will suddenly be untied, okay? But it's there, okay? And it's a sharp, heavy object. It is absolutely going to be used as an offhand weapon, okay? So I have all of those same options we looked at before, where I can block, I can attack, I can get a nice chop through the arm. If I really needed to, I've got double parries and all that kind of stuff. I've got a nice heavy end to thrust with as well if I need it. The other nice advantage about an axe is this little L shape here. And what I can do with that is, if I can hook it over something, I can use it as a hook to pull something offline. So what I can do is take a parry, hook it over, and move their arm completely out the way as I take my attack. I might be able to attack, and if they parry, use it to move their parry out the way and redouble my attack. So I use that more for the hooking than I do for the sharp bit, but it's worth knowing that an axe is a possibility. This isn't a fighting axe, this is actually just a camping axe that I have, but it works just as well. Right, axe, where should we go after that? I suspect we'll move to buckler, I think, after that. Where are we? Yeah. So, buckler, small shield. Because most of the stuff I teach is from a later period, we don't have charges, the kind of bigger Scottish shields, or kite shields, knight shields, any of those all come from kind of earlier periods. So we're really down to the buckler. And I'm not going to use this as a shield to try and hide behind it. Rather, I'm going to use this half of the semicircle to punch into an attack when it comes in. So I'm much more likely to keep it close to the body, and when an attack comes in, I'm going to punch that rim out into it to stop the attack, and then cut. Or I'm going to hold it out in front of me to cut down, again, where they can attack. Okay, because now, all of this area here, from my head to my shoulder, is covered by that shield. Okay, so I now know that attack has to come in here, and I'm ready for it, and I can counter. The other nice thing about it as a buckler is it's quite heavy. So if I can get a parry with it, that becomes one hell of a knuckle duster punch to the face. Also, if I'm in a period where I'm looking more at thrusting, let's go back to the rapier. If I'm looking more to thrust with this weapon, I have the problem my hand is actually quite exposed to a counter thrust. Yeah, if somebody can get over the top and pale me through the hand halfway through, this is not going to finish its thrust. So what I can do is also use it, and this is where we talk about combinations, I can actually deliver my thrust and use the buckler to cover my hand as I thrust, to make sure that nobody can actually take out that hand as it comes in. And that could work on the other side as well. So I start getting attacks that kind of come in, covering my own hand with the buckler. Now, buckler's great. I prefer the modern equivalent, which is the mug. And it is surprising how well, this is like a £1 thermos mug. Surprising how well these work. I can still do those kind of punching actions into an oncoming attack. I can still punch with them. Surprisingly effective. We have a tournament every year where we do random weapons. I have had one of these as an offhand in a tournament. I still have it actually because it has a huge dent in it where it took a full hit from a backsword and then was used to punch the other guy in the face. So really useful equivalent. If you have a mug, anything, I mean, don't use it with a glass or something, but if you have an enamel mug or if you're a fan of tankards or whatever, useful to know, use them like a buckler. Very good for that. Okay, what am I left with? Really only kind of one or two left. Cloak. And I'm sure I have talked about cloak before because it is one of my favourites. You can't parry with it as such. If something's coming in as a thrust, you can swoosh it out the way, but it's not great. As I said, the main advantage of this is a distraction and a flail in my opponent's face to hide when my attack is coming through. To drape over their sword and add extra weight. To drape over their head and remove their line of sight. Okay? Cloak I love, so I'm just mentioning it again in passing. Now the last one that we haven't really talked about is brace or case. Okay, I don't have two side swords, so I have a side sword and a rapier, not quite matched. But the idea of this would be I now have two equal weapons, okay? So, I no longer have an offensive stance, because actually my offensive stance is as defensive as my defensive stance. It's just the fact that this hand is better than this hand. So, I might choose to put my weaker hand forward, I might choose to have my stronger hand forward, but I can fight with both, okay? Now I can use it exactly the same way as I did with the dagger. I can parry with one hand and attack. I can parry with one hand, I can attack. Yeah, I can double parry. But now it doesn't matter which one's on top because they're the same. I just have to know which one's on top. Yeah, because if I get that wrong, I'm fighting myself. So again, decide. I keep the right hand side on top because that's what I'm used to doing with a dagger. So I know instantly which hand that I can attack with, because the other one is still bound. Yeah, I can have my across the body and attacks. I still have all of those options available to me. It's just understanding that I've now got two equal length of weapons, so I can now fight equally with both sides. And this is a lovely situation to be in. Okay? Probably if you have a choice, this is the way to go. So, I'm going to drop that one down again. How long have I got left of this session? Like about 2 minutes. Okay. Yep. So we've covered quite a lot today. Okay? We covered a lot of stuff at the beginning about the naval nature of Cutlass, the footwork involved in Cutlass, the situation of a Cutlass, and then actually how you use the Cutlass itself. And to be honest, what I've taught you today is probably more complicated than most people who ever had to use a Cutlass had the training. Okay? It was really designed as a simple weapon. But we've also seen all of the offhand uses you can have. If you can pick up two weapons, you can become more defensive. We've looked at it in terms of the things available to pirates or naval crews, and we've looked at it from a more kind of fencing point of view. So we've covered the basics of two-hand fighting. I've then just had a run through of some of the common offhand weapons you might encounter if you go to any historical fencing school, and a bit about the differences between them. And that kind of takes me to running out of time. So next week we're going to be looking at a really, really horrible little piece of kit, which is the straight razor. Think of your old cutthroat razor. We're going to be using that to do horrible, horrible things to people next week. Not self-defense. It entirely comes under the historical fencing part for me. It was used by a weapon, particularly in places like Italy, in gang warfare. So we're going to have a look at a bit about how we use the straight razor, and then I'm going to finish off with a bit of a roundup and some useful, hopefully, hints and tips if anybody wants to keep training after I've finished. And that will take us to the end. So that's kind of next week. So really, all that's left to do now is to fall out. So I should fall out with two weapons since I've been using two weapons today. There we go. So, attention, and fall out. Right, well, thank you very much for being with me again today. I'll see you next time for our final, something like session 17 and our final installment. Until then, you know, look after yourself, stay safe, start getting back into training, but train safely. And above all, just be kind. And I shall catch you guys next week. Okay.